Hello and welcome, friends of Voices of the History, the podcast where the past comes to life and its echoes resonate to this day. Get ready for a journey through time, where the mysteries, conspiracies, and most amazing facts of history are revealed like never before. Today we are going to take a walk through the Castilian lands, in the time before and after the arrival of Columbus to the New World. We will give a small brushstroke to briefly see what the customs of the time were, to try to get closer to what their lives were like. What pushed you to go to the American continent? What were the motivations, and how was the way of interacting with new cultures forged? Ready to discover a brief piece of history? Start.
All right, so get ready, because we're going deep, really deep into Castilian society.
Oh.
Right before and during those early years of the conquest of the Americas.
Yes.
We're not just talking names and dates, though.
No.
We're going way beyond that. We're talking about the people, their lives, their values, what they believed in.
Right.
Even what they wore. We've got some incredible sources for this deep dive. Excerpts from historical chronicles. They're practically time machines.
Yeah.
We've got some really insightful academic papers. And, wait for it, even a first-hand account from an actual conquistador.
Wow.
Talk about a deep dive. Right?
That's going to be quite a journey. It really is fascinating to consider, imagine yourself back then, late 15th, early 16th century Castile.
Okay.
A kingdom that's just on the edge, on the verge of massive change. The Reconquista is wrapping up.
Right.
New trade routes are opening up like crazy. There's this feeling, this energy in the air. Religious fervor, ambition, you name it.
So not just a bunch of adventurers hopping on a ship on a whim.
Not at all. Not at all. To understand the conquest, you have to understand the people, the individuals who made it happen. They were products of this very specific time and place. And to understand them even better, we have to zoom out a bit and look at the whole political landscape.
Yeah. Makes sense.
We're talking a powerful monarchy really trying to consolidate its authority, a complex relationship between the crown, the nobles, and the everyday people.
It's like all these historical dominoes, all lined up, just waiting to fall one after the other. But okay, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. I want to know about their daily life. What did these people actually wear?
Oh, this is where it gets fun. Okay, picture this. You've got your average peasant, right? Practical clothing. We're talking simple tunics and cloaks, the kind of stuff that'll get you through the day.
Yeah, sensible.
But then you've got the nobility.
Oh, here we go.
They're strutting around in these elaborate outfits.
I bet.
One chronicle even describes a nobleman sporting a black hat of a very new fashion. Apparently, black hats, that was the it item back then.
Black hats and rich jewels, too.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
If those chronicles are anything to go by.
Yes, absolutely.
Like a Renaissance fashion show.
Yeah.
But, okay, fashion aside, what about their food?
Okay, food. So, this is interesting.
Yeah.
Whether you were a peasant or a nobleman, everyone kind of had the same staples in their diet.
Right.
Bread, olive oil, wine, and when they could get it, some meat.
Okay. Sounds pretty Mediterranean.
It does, doesn't it?
Yep.
But of course, if you were wealthy, you had access to more variety, more spices, the good stuff. And there's even a mention of a dish called a German empanada in the chronicles.
A German empanada.
It really shows you that even back then, there was this culinary exchange happening across different cultures.
German empanada.
Yeah.
That's fusion cuisine right there. Okay, so we've covered fashion. We've talked about the food.
Yes.
What about their houses? Was it castles for everyone, or was it a little more down to earth?
Well, not quite castles for everyone.
Right.
But housing definitely varied a lot depending on your social standing.
I can imagine.
Now, if you lived out in the rural areas, you probably lived in a pretty simple dwelling, often sparsely furnished. It was about practicality more than luxury.
Makes sense.
Then you have the wealthy with their grand palaces.
Of course.
But even their idea of dining together was different from what we might imagine. Furniture was scarce and it was valuable.
Oh, really?
So people often ate sitting on stools or even on the floor. Can you imagine?
That is a very different picture. It's fascinating how these small details, when you hear about them, it really paints a different picture, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
But you mentioned religion earlier. How big of a role did faith play in their lives, would you say?
Huge. Absolutely huge. It was central to their lives. You have to remember the context here. The Reconquista, centuries of battling Muslim rule, that created this deep sense of religious mission, almost like a constant undercurrent in their lives.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you have the Crusades, which introduced this concept of holy war. And remember, those indulgences, people bought to finance them.
Oh, yeah. And speaking of those indulgences, it's interesting. One of the historical papers we're looking at actually mentions that they started using indulgences to fund the conquests in the Americas as well.
That's right.
It's like they took the fundraising model and just kind of adapted it.
They did. It's really interesting. They created this, well, some might say strange, mixture of religious justification and, let's be honest, a financial incentive for expansion.
A very potent combination. So let's talk about the military machine that made the conquest even possible.
Okay, yes.
I was looking through that military history source, and it's pretty clear. These Castilians were a fierce to be reckoned with.
Oh, absolutely.
They had this interesting blend of classic medieval warfare, heavy cavalry charging in.
Yes.
But also this new technology like firearms and early cannons.
It's almost like they were in this period of military R&D, trying to figure out how to make the old and the new work together.
Right, the best of both worlds.
And impressively, they didn't just stick with the old ways. One chronicle mentions them using very long pikes tipped with kuiper to counter enemy cavalry.
Whoa, that's pretty innovative.
Tactical innovation at its finest.
So they were adaptable.
Oh, they had to be.
Makes sense.
Especially with all the new challenges they faced in the Americas.
Right. So those military skills, all honed over centuries of Iberian conflict, they became their secret weapon.
Yeah.
They're winning battles against sometimes impossible odds.
They were.
It's amazing. But it wasn't all just victories and glory, right?
No.
I mean, you read these sources, and there's this tension, this contradiction almost.
Absolutely.
This deep faith alongside some pretty brutal actions.
You've put your finger on a key paradox of the era. And there's no better example of this than Bernal Diaz del Castillo's account.
Oh, yeah.
He's a conquistador himself, writing about his own experiences. And his account is this fascinating blend of justifications for conquest, descriptions of indigenous cultures, and even at times these hints of, almost an internal moral struggle.
It's like he's trying to convince himself as much as he's trying to convince his readers.
Maybe.
It makes you wonder, were these conquests really all about greed? Or did religion play a more complex role in their minds?
That's a question historians are still debating to this day.
I bet.
And it gets right to the heart of how the Castilians viewed the indigenous people, the people they were encountering.
Yeah.
Did they see them as equals? Did they see them as potential converts? Or were they simply obstacles to be overcome?
We're talking about a real clash of cultures here, aren't we? A meeting of two completely different worldviews. It's heavy stuff.
It is heavy stuff, no doubt. And that's precisely why diving deep into Castilian society with all its ambition and contradictions and, yes, even its fashion choices is so important. It helps us understand this pivotal point in history and perhaps even see ourselves, our own time, a little more clearly.
I think you're right. It really makes you think, about the monarchy. What was their role in all of this? I mean, they weren't just sitting back and letting it all happen, were they?
Oh, definitely not. No way. You've got to think about it. Late 15th, early 16th century, you've got these powerful monarchs like Ferdinand and Isabella. They were all about consolidating power, expanding their reach, And the Americas, well, that was basically their golden ticket, a chance for incredible wealth and prestige.
Right. So they weren't exactly giving the conquistadors free rein then.
Not at all. They were very much involved funding expeditions, appointing governors. They even built up this whole bureaucracy, this whole system to manage those overseas holdings.
It's amazing how all these different factors, all these forces like the monarchy, the conquistadors, the role of religion, even just that basic human hunger for wealth, all come together to create this huge historical turning point. It kind of gives me chills just thinking about it.
It really does, doesn't it? It makes you realize the sheer scale of it all. And to truly get it, to understand what happened, we really need to get inside the minds of the people involved. Speaking of which, you know what really struck me? How complex the social structure was back in Castile. It wasn't just a simple hierarchy, top to bottom.
Now that you mention it, I never really thought about that.
It's fascinating. Imagine this. You've got your nobility, of course. They're at the top, holding all the power and influence.
Right.
Then you have the vast majority of the population.
Yeah.
Farmers, artisans, merchants, they're the backbone of society, really.
Yeah, the everyday folks.
Exactly. But then you also have this group called the conversos.
The conversos. Right, now remind me who they were again.
Okay, so the conversos were those who had converted from Judaism to Christianity.
Okay.
But even though they'd converted, they often faced suspicion and discrimination.
Wow, so even within a single society, there were these deep divisions, these fault lines.
Exactly. And it's something that can be traced back to the Reconquista, that long struggle to establish religious uniformity.
Right.
So these conversos, they were often pushed to the margins, excluded from positions of power, all that.
It makes you think how these kinds of divisions might have played out in the Americas, too.
Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting. A lot of those conquistadors, they seem to come from these lower noble families, almost like they were trying to prove themselves.
That's a good point. They were probably looking to make a name for themselves.
Exactly. The conquest wasn't just about, grabbing land and resources. It was a chance for these guys to climb the social ladder, build a reputation, secure a better future for their families.
It's like the Americas were this giant opportunity, this blank slate where they could create their own destinies. That has been incredibly powerful, that kind of motivation.
Oh, it was. For many of them, it was a chance to escape those constraints, those limitations of Castilian society. Of course, all of this, came at a huge cost to the indigenous people.
A cost that can't be ignored, for sure. It's the dark side of the story that we have to acknowledge.
Absolutely. We need to recognize the displacement, the enslavement, the loss of life that came with the conquest.
It really makes you appreciate how, by understanding these complexities of Castilian society, all their ambitions, their hierarchies, it helps us come to grips with what the conquest really meant, the good and the bad.
For sure. And speaking of complexities, have you ever thought about the Spanish bureaucracy?
Oh, yeah.
They had this unbelievable bureaucracy in the Americas.
I can only imagine.
They were obsessed with keeping records of everything, taxes, land grants, indigenous populations, everything was meticulously documented.
I was actually reading about that in one of the historical papers. They were the original data hoarders, centuries before the internet.
They were determined to control this vast empire they'd built, and that meant mountains of paperwork, let me tell you. It reminds us that the conquest wasn't all about brute force. It was also about administration, a slow and steady process of building an empire.
Right. But all that bureaucracy, I imagine it wasn't always a good thing, right?
Well, of course not. It often meant extracting wealth from the colonies, enforcing Spanish authority, all that. Even Bernal Diaz del Castillo, in his account, he mentions how much the indigenous communities resented all those demands from those Spanish officials.
His account is a good reminder that the conquest wasn't just some abstract series of battles, It was real life, a lived reality with very real consequences for the people on the receiving end of it all.
Exactly. And it kind of makes me wonder, amidst all of this, the monarchy, the conquistadors, this massive bureaucracy, what was life actually like for the everyday Castilian back home?
I'm curious about that, too. Did they even feel the impact of everything that was happening across the ocean?
Well, daily life for them, it varied tremendously depending on your social standing. Peasants, for example, they made up the majority of the population.
Right.
They were tied to the land. They lived simple lives rooted in hard work and religious devotion.
The chronicles describe them living in these close-knit communities.
Yes.
You even get glimpses into their clothing, their diet.
Exactly. And it's all very practical, nothing extravagant.
Right.
They wore tunics, cloaks, hats, basic stuff. And their food was simple, too. Bread, beans, vegetables, occasionally some meat or fish if they were lucky. And their homes, well, those were modest, too, often made of stone or wood. They didn't have a lot of possessions, and furniture was really scarce.
A far cry from the palaces and feasts of the nobility.
Oh, yeah, a completely different world. But even among the elite, you see this strong sense of religious duty, social obligation.
Really?
The chronicles mention these grand processions and these lavish festivals,
Sure.
But also acts of charity and patronage. It's like they saw themselves as responsible for those beneath them on the social ladder.
Right. It makes you realize that even with all the divisions, Castilian society was still bound together by these shared values, these shared traditions.
Absolutely.
And those values, well, they would end up shaping those colonies across the ocean.
Exactly. It's fascinating how those cultural threads traveled such vast distances.
Speaking of cultural threads, we can't forget about the importance of religion in Castilian life.
No, absolutely not.
We've talked about how the church financed those conquests.
Right.
But it went way deeper than that. Faith really shaped their entire worldview, their understanding of the world.
Oh, it did. Castile was deeply, deeply Catholic. We're talking about a long, rich history and tradition that was woven into the very fabric of their lives. The chronicles are just filled with descriptions of these grand cathedrals, elaborate rituals, this deep reverence for the Virgin Mary.
It's like their faith was present in every aspect of their existence, birth, death, everything in between. It gave them comfort, guidance, a sense of community.
Exactly. And that religious fervor, well, that would become a major driving force for those conquistadors.
It makes sense.
They genuinely believed they were bringing the Christian faith to this new world.
Which, of course, raises all sorts of questions about their treatment of the indigenous population.
It does. You see, they believed they had this divine mission, this God-given responsibility to convert the indigenous people to Christianity, even if it meant using force.
Right.
And while this brings up all sorts of ethical dilemmas, all sorts of questions about the nature of the conquest and its impact on indigenous beliefs and ways of life.
It's a complicated legacy to grapple with.
Oh, for sure. On the one hand, you could argue that the Spanish introduced Christianity to the Americas, and that had a huge, a monumental cultural impact.
Right.
But on the other hand, we have to acknowledge that conversion was often brutal, often coercive, leading to the suppression and sometimes the complete erasure of indigenous religions and spiritual practices.
Yeah. It's a stark reminder that the conquest wasn't just about expanding territory or grabbing resources. It was about a collision, a clash of cultures and religions with consequences that we're still dealing with today.
Absolutely. It's something we can't forget.
You know, one thing that just keeps coming up for me is this idea of contradictions within Castilian society.
Yes, very true.
Like, on the one hand, they were deeply religious, charitable people.
And yet, on the other hand, capable of incredible brutality, especially towards those indigenous populations.
Exactly. It's a puzzle. How do you make sense of those two sides? How do you reconcile those two seemingly opposite sides of the same coin?
It's important to keep in mind that history is rarely black and white. People, they're complicated.
Right.
They can hold what seem like contradictory beliefs, and their actions don't always perfectly align with their stated values.
True. Yeah.
And I think Bernal Diaz del Castillo's account really exemplifies this.
Oh, absolutely. Here's this devout man.
Yeah.
And yet he's a conquistador. He's actively participating in the conquest.
He expresses this strong faith.
Right.
And he truly believes that the conquest is this righteous cause. But at the same time, he acknowledges that violence and greed were also very powerful motivators for many conquistadors, himself included.
You really see him wrestling with it all, struggling internally.
Yeah.
He describes the cruelty, but he also talks about moments of compassion. It's almost as if he's grappling with the moral implications of his own actions.
It's a really powerful reminder that we need to approach history with nuance. We need to resist those easy judgments. The conquest, it was driven by a whole web of factors, some more noble than others.
Right. Speaking of those finer details, those more personal aspects,
Yeah.
I really loved how our sources brought those to life, like their love of processions, for example. That really stood out for me.
Yes, the processions, those were so central to their religious and social lives.
They were huge.
The historical papers are full of these vivid descriptions of processions for all sorts of occasions.
Right.
Saints' days, coronations, even funerals.
I remember reading about a procession for a papal bull, of all things. A papal bull about indulgences for the crusade.
It's incredible. They turned what could have been just a simple announcement into this huge spectacle.
It was a whole event.
Meticulously planned. The route, the stops at different churches, the public squares, it was all about being seen.
They weren't just rituals either, right? They were these opportunities for people to show off, to socialize, maybe even do a little politicking on the side.
Oh, for sure. The chronicles describe them as really lively events.
I bet.
Music, dancing, these elaborate costumes. Just imagine the streets packed with people, banners waving, the smell of incense in the air. What a sight it must have been.
It's like these processions were almost a microcosm of Castilian society itself. All the hierarchies, the rituals, that mix of piety and showmanship.
Exactly. They offer this amazing glimpse into the cultural fabric of the time. A reminder that history isn't just about dates and battles, but about the everyday lives, the lived experiences of people. And, speaking of people, it's fascinating how diverse Castilian society actually was.
That's right. We've been talking about the nobility, the clergy, the common folk.
Right.
But there were other groups that added to that mix that made it even richer.
You see evidence of Jewish communities, Muslim communities, even groups of foreigners who had settled in Castile.
Wow, really?
They brought their own traditions, their own beliefs and customs with them.
That's amazing. I remember reading about Italian merchants, Flemish artisans, even German soldiers living in Castilian cities.
It's incredible, isn't it? And all that cultural exchange, it really enriched Castilian society.
It must have.
New ideas were flowing in, new technologies, even new artistic styles.
I remember reading about a dish called a German empanada in one chronicle. It seems like they were open to new culinary influences too.
Oh, absolutely. And we can't forget the influence of Islamic culture.
Right, of course.
You can see it in their architecture, their music, even their language.
It's a great reminder that Castile, even with its strong Catholic identity, was really a crossroads, a place where so many different traditions met and mingled.
Exactly. And that cultural diversity, well, it would have played a part in the conquest of the Americas, too.
That's true. I hadn't thought about it like that.
Just imagine encountering all those indigenous cultures in the New World. The Spanish, they had to adapt, just like they'd been doing back home.
You know what really stood out to me? The Castilians' fascination with military history, with strategy.
Oh, yes. It wasn't just about brute force for them.
No.
They had this real intellectual side to their approach to warfare.
One historical paper mentioned that Castilian commanders would study ancient Roman military treatises. They were learning from the masters.
They were, and they weren't just blindly copying those old tactics either.
No.
They adapted them. They incorporated new technologies like gunpowder, artillery. They were real innovators in that sense.
And I bet all those years spent battling the Moors during the Reconquista, all those years of conflict, that must have taught them a lot about logistics and planning as well, right?
You're absolutely right.
All those supply lines, the fortifications, all that groundwork.
Exactly. And those lessons learned on the Iberian Peninsula, they would prove to be absolutely invaluable in the Americas.
Yeah, they had a lot to draw on.
They faced new challenges, of course.
Right.
But they had this wealth of experience to draw upon.
It's like they were constantly evolving their approach to warfare, which makes sense. It explains how they were able to achieve so many victories, sometimes against much larger forces.
They were masters of adapting to this situation. It's truly remarkable. But, you know, amidst all these grand strategies and all those battlefield maneuvers, it's easy to lose sight of the human cost, the everyday realities of being a soldier.
Right. War is more than just tactics and formations, isn't it? It's about human experiences, individual stories.
And that's something Bernal Diaz del Castillo really captures beautifully in his account.
He does.
He really brings home the hardship of those campaigns, the hunger, the disease, the ever-present threat of death.
It's like reading a diary entry from the front lines.
Exactly.
He talks about the fear, the exhaustion, the tough choices soldiers had to make. It humanizes the whole experience.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that the conquest wasn't just this glorious adventure. It was also this grueling, often traumatic experience.
It really makes you wonder how those experiences, how going through something like that shaped their views of the Americas, of the indigenous people.
It must have had a profound impact, no doubt. And speaking of individual experiences, you know, it's amazing how much we learn when we focus on those personal stories, rather than just the big famous names.
It's so easy to get caught up in the stories of, Cortez or Pizarro, Columbus. But the conquest was about so much more than just them. It involved countless individuals, each with their own motivations and their own stories.
And those stories, the ones that are often overlooked, they can be so incredibly insightful. They really give us a glimpse into the human dimension of this massive historical event.
Bernal Diaz del Castillo's account, for example, gives us a window into the lives of those ordinary soldiers, their struggles, their triumphs, their internal conflicts.
He talks about the camaraderie, the bonds forged in battle, the shared hardship. But he also highlights the rivalries, the betrayals, the cruelty.
It's a reminder that the conquest wasn't just this clash of civilizations. It was a clash of personalities, a human drama playing out on this grand scale.
Exactly. And those individual stories, those voices that are often lost to history, they can really help us understand the complexity, the nuance of this pivotal moment in human history.
Listening to all of this, it really makes you think.
It does, doesn't it?
About how these huge historical events, these massive shifts in power and culture, they really come down to individual choices, individual actions.
That's what makes history so fascinating. It's not just these abstract forces at work. It's about people, their decisions, their stories. It's a tapestry woven from countless individual threads.
It is. It really is. And speaking of individual stories, one thing that I found really interesting was how much importance the Castilians placed on lineage and ancestry.
Oh, absolutely. It was everything. Noble bloodlines, family ties, those were the keys to social standing. Your lineage defined who you were, where you fit into the grand scheme of things.
It was everything. And one of those historical papers, I think it was the one on social mobility, mentioned how even commoners were obsessed with tracing their family trees.
They were. They were always looking for even the tiniest connection, the most distant link to nobility.
Hoping to find that one ancestor, right? That one noble ancestor who could elevate their status. It makes you wonder, did this obsession with lineage, with family history, did it play a role in the conquest itself?
That's a really interesting question. It probably did.
I mean, obviously, the conquistadors themselves, they were driven by personal ambition. They wanted to gain titles, land for themselves. But what about their families back home?
That's a great point. The Americas weren't just about individual gain. They were a chance to establish family dynasties.
So it wasn't just, about one person's ambition, but about building a future for generations to come.
Exactly. They wanted to secure a legacy that would elevate their family's status back in Castile.
It puts a whole new spin on things, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
And that focus on family legacy, that desire to create a lasting dynasty, well, it would go on to shape the social structure of the Americas for centuries to come.
I could see how that would happen.
The descendants of those conquistadors, they often held these really privileged positions in colonial society.
It's amazing how some of these patterns, you see them repeating throughout history. It's easy to think of late 15th, early 16th century Castile as this really distant, almost irrelevant period. But going through all of this, what strikes me is how much it still resonates, how much it connects to issues we're still grappling with today.
It's true. Those fundamental questions about social inequality, the influence of religion, the allure of wealth and power, those are timeless, really, part of the human condition.
And the conquest itself, with all its complexities, its moral ambiguities, it offers this really profound look into human nature, into our capacity for both incredible acts of courage and terrible acts of cruelty.
Absolutely. It's a stark reminder that history isn't just about the past. It's a mirror reflecting back on ourselves, helping us understand the forces that have shaped the world we live in today.
And by delving into these stories, by trying to understand the motivations and the experiences of those who came before us, I think we can gain a deeper appreciation for the challenges and the opportunities that we face in our own time.
It's about making those connections, those links across time, finding those threads that bind us to the past and how they shed light on our present.
Well, on that note, I think we've come to the end of our deep dive into Castilian society. It's been an incredible journey, hasn't it?
Yeah.
We've explored everything from their fashion to their complicated relationship with religion to the driving forces behind that incredible conquest of the Americas.
It has been a fascinating exploration. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. But even after all of that, I feel like we've only scratched the surface.
Oh, we have. There's always so much more to learn, more stories waiting to be uncovered, more perspectives to consider.
And that's the beauty of history, isn't it? It's this ongoing conversation. It's a journey of discovery that never really ends. So we encourage you to keep exploring, to keep asking those questions, to keep challenging your own assumptions. There's a whole world of captivating stories out there just waiting to be discovered. And who knows what you might find.
History is not only what happened, but what still resonates in our present. If you liked this episode, subscribe, and activate the campaign so you don't miss the next stories that will change the way you see the past. See you in the next chapter of Voices of History, where yesterday continues to write tomorrow. See you soon.